Before we begin, do me one favor and subscribe, because the pattern setting up over the East Coast right now is not a single storm or a single hot afternoon. It is a stacked sequence of hazards, one lining up right behind the other, and forecasters are watching all of them at once. For weeks, the eastern half of the country has been trapped in some version of extreme heat, and just when it looked like the pattern might finally break, the atmosphere has thrown something more complicated at the region. Heat, tropical moisture, flash flooding, and even smoke, all converging within the same 10-day window. So stay with me, because by the end of this, you will understand exactly what forecasters are tracking, why they are treating the next 10 days differently than a normal midsummer stretch, and what it actually means for the tens of millions of people who live along that stretch of coastline. Let's start with where things stand right now, because the setup matters just as much as what comes next. For much of the past several weeks, a stubborn ridge of high pressure has been rotating through different parts of the country, baking whichever region happened to sit beneath it. That ridge spent time parked over the east around the 4th of July, then shifted west, then rebuilt itself over the central states. Now, as this new 10-day window opens, forecasters are watching that same ridge nose back toward the east coast, but this time it is not arriving alone. A separate weather feature, a trough digging down out of the north, is expected to interact with it. And where a strong ridge and a digging trough collide, the atmosphere tends to get unstable in ways that produce exactly the kind of hazardous weather meteorologists are now flagging. Before going further, it helps to understand the basic mechanics of what a ridge and a trough actually are, because these two words show up constantly in 10-day outlooks, and most people have never had them explained simply. Think of the jet streams, that fast river of air several miles above the ground, as a long rope stretched loosely across a table. If you push the middle of that rope upward into a bump, you have created what meteorologists call a ridge, a bulge of high pressure that tends to bring warm, dry, sinking air to whatever sits directly underneath it. If instead you pull part of that rope downward into a dip, you have created a trough, an area where colder air digs south and rising air tends to fuel storms and rain. Weather in the United States is essentially the product of this rope, constantly bending into ridges and troughs and shifting eastward across the country. Most of the time, this bending is gentle and the pattern moves along at a reasonable pace. But when a ridge and a trough end up sitting right next to each other, locked in place rather than drifting past, the boundary between them becomes a battleground. And that battleground is exactly where forecasters are pointing when they say the East Coast is facing an unusually active 10 days. Here is where the heat piece of this story picks back up. Forecasters have been tracking temperatures forecast to push toward 100 degrees from the Dakotas to New Hampshire before that same searing air mass reaches the mid-Atlantic. This is not a brand new heat dome appearing out of nowhere. It is the latest chapter of the same rotating pattern that has dominated the country's weather all summer, swinging back east after a stretch out over the interior. What makes this particular round worth paying close attention to is not just the raw temperature number, but how it is expected to collide with moisture streaming up from the south and from the tropics at nearly the same time. That moisture piece is the part of this story that has genuinely elevated forecaster concern beyond a typical heat advisory. The Weather Prediction Center has flagged a marginal risk of excessive rainfall stretching from the Great Lakes into the Mid-Atlantic region, citing a strengthening signal in both operational forecast models and ensemble guidance, along with a significant amount of moisture already in place over the region. At the same time, forecasters have been tracking a broader pattern where heat and humidity linger across the mid-Atlantic, monsoonal showers and thunderstorms continue across the western United States, and stormy weather is expected across the northern tier and into the mid-Atlantic. Layer all of that together, and you get a picture of an atmosphere that is simultaneously hot, humid, unstable, and loaded with moisture, which is close to the exact recipe for flash flooding. There is also a coastal piece to this story that deserves its own explanation because it changes the character of the risk along the immediate shoreline compared to inland areas. Forecasters have been watching a strong coastal low expected to develop and bring flooding, high surf, dangerous rip currents, gusty winds, and heavy rain to much of the East Coast as this pattern evolves. A coastal low behaves differently from an inland thunderstorm complex. Rather than a fast-moving cluster of storms that passes through in an hour or two, a coastal low can sit and spin for days, drawing in ocean moisture continuously and wringing it out over the same stretch of coastline again and again. That is part of why beach communities up and down the eastern seaboard are being warned not just about rain totals, but about the ocean itself. Elevated surf, dangerous rip currents strong enough to overpower even confident swimmers, and the kind of coastal flooding that can turn a routine high tide into a genuine hazard for low-lying streets and boardwalks. Let me walk you through why forecasters take rip currents so seriously, because this is a hazard that quietly kills more people during events like this than almost any other single factor, and it rarely gets the same attention as the flooding or the wind. A rip current is a narrow, fast-moving channel of water flowing away from the shore, formed when water that has been pushed onto the beach by breaking waves finds a low spot in the sandbar or a gap near a jetty and rushes back out to sea through that opening. When storm systems churn up the ocean offshore, even far offshore, they generate larger and more powerful waves that reach the coast well before the storm itself arrives. And those larger waves dramatically increase both the frequency and the strength of rip currents on beaches that might otherwise look calm and inviting. This is exactly why lifeguards and forecasters warn people repeatedly during events like this one, because the water can look perfectly swimmable on the surface while a current strong enough to overpower an adult swimmer runs just beneath it. Now, let's bring the tropical piece of this puzzle into focus, because it is the ingredient that has shifted this from a normal heat and thunderstorm pattern into something forecasters are treating with extra caution. An area of low pressure has been tracked moving across the Florida peninsula, and forecasters have maintained continuity in their outlook for Florida and the coastal southeast because of it. Systems like this do not need to become a named tropical storm to cause serious problems. Even a disorganized area of low pressure moving through the deep, humid tropical air mass, typical of mid to late summer, can tap into enormous amounts of moisture and produce torrential, slow-moving rainfall, the kind that overwhelms drainage systems far more effectively than a fast-moving line of ordinary thunderstorms. When a system like this tracks up the southeast coast and interacts with the ridge and trough boundary already sitting over the mid-Atlantic and northeast, it can extend and intensify the flood risk considerably, which is exactly the kind of chained, compounding hazard forecasters are describing when they talk about this stretch differently than a routine 10-day outlook. There is one more layer to this story that people do not expect to hear about in a forecast for the East Coast, and that is smoke. Air quality alerts have been issued spanning from the upper Midwest and Great Lakes into New England, tied to wildfire smoke drifting down out of Canada, where dry conditions following an intense heat dome have left forests primed to burn. Smoke does something counterintuitive to a heat forecast. A thick layer of smoke sitting several thousand feet up can actually act like a filter, blocking enough direct sunlight to shave a few degrees off what the temperature would otherwise reach, while at the same time making the air people are breathing measurably worse. So a city under this pattern could simultaneously see a slightly less extreme high temperature than models originally suggested, while dealing with air quality bad enough to trigger health warnings for anyone with asthma, other respiratory conditions, or heart disease. It is a strange trade, one hazard partially offsetting another on the thermometer while making the overall health picture worse, not better. Let me be very clear and very honest here, because that honesty is the foundation of everything I do. 10-day forecasts are genuinely useful for identifying a pattern, the broad strokes of where heat will build, where moisture will pool, and where the greatest risk of flooding or coastal impacts will concentrate. But they are not a promise of exact rainfall totals for your specific zip code on a specific day 8 or 9 days from now. The atmosphere at that range is still a probability, not a certainty, and forecasters openly acknowledge the uncertainty involved. Different forecast models have shown real disagreement about exactly how this pattern evolves in the back half of the window, with one major model favoring additional heat pushing into the northeast and mid-Atlantic from the central United States, while another favors a cooling trough taking over instead. That kind of split between models is common at longer ranges, and it is exactly why forecasters describe this as a period to watch closely rather than a locked-in outcome. What is not in dispute is the overall theme: elevated heat, elevated moisture, and elevated risk of both flooding rain and dangerous coastal conditions converging on the same stretch of the country within the same window. It's worth taking a moment to explain why compounding hazards like this are so much more dangerous than any one of them would be on its own, because this is really the core of why forecasters are raising their voice about the next 10 days specifically. A heat wave on its own is dangerous, but people in the eastern United States have some experience handling one, especially after the events earlier this summer. A round of heavy rain on its own usually passes through and drains away without lasting consequences in most well-maintained areas. A single day of rough surf and rip currents is a known manageable coastal hazard that lifeguards deal with regularly. But stack all three together: heat straining the power grid and the human body at the same time, flooding rain is overwhelming drainage systems, and coastal flooding is complicating evacuation routes near the shoreline. And you get a scenario where the whole becomes genuinely more dangerous than the sum of its parts. Emergency responders cannot focus on just one hazard when three are unfolding simultaneously. Let's talk specifically about what flash flooding actually looks like when it happens in a densely populated, heavily paved region like much of the East Coast corridor, because this is genuinely one of the most underestimated hazards in American weather. Unlike a slow rising river flood that gives days of warning, flash flooding can develop in a matter of an hour or two, sometimes less, when intense rainfall falls faster than the ground and the drainage system can absorb it. In cities and suburbs with extensive pavement, rainwater has almost nowhere to soak in, so it runs directly into storm drains that were engineered decades ago for a climate that produced less intense rainfall than what is common today. When those systems get overwhelmed, water backs up into streets, underpasses, and low-lying areas with startling speed. This is why so many flash flood deaths happen in vehicles, when a driver underestimates how quickly a flooded road can become impassable and dangerous, sometimes sweeping a car off the roadway entirely. The rule that meteorologists repeat constantly, turn around, don't drown, exists precisely because it only takes about a foot of moving water to carry away most passenger vehicles, and floodwater on a roadway is almost always deeper and faster moving than it appears from behind a windshield. I also want to spend a moment on the heat piece specifically as it applies to people living along the coast, because there is a common misconception that coastal areas automatically get relief from extreme heat thanks to the ocean nearby. That is sometimes true, but it depends heavily on wind direction, and during a pattern like the one setting up now, onshore breezes are not guaranteed to dominate every single day. When the wind shifts to come off the land instead of off the water, even communities just a mile or two from the beach can see the sea breeze relief disappear entirely, and combined with high humidity streaming in from the tropical moisture feeding this pattern, heat index values along parts of the coast can climb into dangerous territory, even in towns that residents have always thought of as naturally cooler than inland cities. So what should you actually be watching for over these next 10 days, wherever along the east coast you happen to be? In the earlier part of the window, expect the heat to build first, particularly as that ridge noses back eastward, with the mid-Atlantic and parts of the northeast seeing the most significant rise in both temperature and heat index values. As tropical moisture and the coastal low interact with that heat later in the window, expect the risk to shift toward heavy, potentially flooding rainfall, especially in urban and low-lying areas that drain poorly, along with the coastal hazards, rough surf, rip currents, and possible minor coastal flooding tracking up and down the shoreline. And running underneath all of it, keep an eye on air quality alerts if you live anywhere from the Great Lakes through New England, since wildfire smoke drifting down from Canada has already proven capable of degrading air quality even when the immediate forecast focuses on heat or rain. Let me walk you through what preparation actually looks like for a stretch like this, because a compounding pattern calls for slightly broader preparation than a single hazard would. First, if you live along the immediate coastline, pay close attention to beach hazard statements and rip current warnings, not just the rain forecast, because the ocean itself becomes measurably more dangerous during a pattern like this, even on days that look sunny from the sand. Second, know your local flood history, because flash flooding tends to hit the same low-lying streets, underpasses, and drainage-poor neighborhoods again and again, and knowing those spots in your own area ahead of time means you can plan an alternate route before you are sitting in a flooded intersection at night. Third, treat any air quality alert seriously if you have asthma, other respiratory conditions, or heart disease, since smoke combined with heat is a genuinely dangerous combination for vulnerable individuals, even when neither hazard alone would be severe. Fourth, keep phone batteries charged and know how your community issues emergency alerts, since flash flooding in particular can develop and become dangerous faster than a typical news cycle can keep up with. And fifth, remember the basic rule that saves more lives than almost any other single piece of advice during flooding events: never drive or walk into moving water, no matter how shallow it looks, because the depth and force of floodwater are almost always deceptive from a standing or seated vantage point. There's a broader pattern worth reflecting on here, and it connects back to something meteorologists have been saying all summer. This is not the first time this year that heat, moisture, and instability have stacked up together over the same region within a short window, and it is unlikely to be the last. Climate scientists have pointed out that both El Niño conditions and the long-term human-caused warming trend contribute to increasing the severity of heat waves. And that same warmer, more moisture-laden atmosphere also has a well-documented tendency to produce heavier bursts of rainfall when storms do form, since warmer air is physically capable of holding more water vapor before it condenses and falls. So a summer defined by repeated heat domes is also, almost as a direct consequence, a summer more prone to intense, flooding-capable rainfall whenever the pattern finally breaks down. The two hazards are not unrelated stories happening to occur in the same season. They are two expressions of the same warmer, wetter atmospheric baseline this entire year has been operating from. Let me be honest about the limits of this forecast one more time, because I think it matters more here than in almost any other kind of weather story. A 10-day outlook like this is a genuine, well-supported signal from experienced meteorologists using real models and real data, and it deserves to be taken seriously. But it is not a script written in stone. The exact day the heaviest rain falls in any particular city, the exact strength the coastal low reaches, the exact path any tropical moisture takes, all of these details will sharpen considerably as the window gets closer, the way they always do. What forecasters are confident about right now is the shape of the risk: elevated heat early, increasing flood and coastal danger as the window progresses, and an underlying atmosphere primed to produce exactly this kind of compounding, multi-hazard stretch. That confidence in the pattern, even without certainty in every detail, is exactly why this warning is being issued now rather than waiting until the individual pieces are only a day or two away. It's worth spending a moment on how forecasters actually arrive at a warning like this, because the process is more interesting and more rigorous than most people assume. A 10-day outlook is not one meteorologist looking at a single computer model and making a call. It is built from an entire ensemble of models, dozens of separate simulations of the atmosphere. Each one started with slightly different initial conditions to account for the fact that we can never measure the current state of the atmosphere with perfect precision. When most of those simulations agree on a general outcome, heat building here, moisture pooling there, forecasters gain real confidence in the broad pattern, even if the individual members disagree on smaller details like the exact rainfall total in a specific county. When a warning like this one gets issued this far in advance, it typically means that agreement across the ensemble has crossed a threshold where the risk is considered too significant to wait on, even with some of the finer details still unsettled. That is a meaningful distinction from the kind of overconfident, clickbait-style forecasting that sometimes shows up online, and it's part of why official sources like the National Weather Service and the Weather Prediction Center carry the credibility they do. There's also a regional patchwork quality to this kind of event that is worth understanding, because it explains why your experience of this pattern might look completely different from a friend's experience just a few hours up or down the coast. The mid-Atlantic, stretching roughly from Virginia through New Jersey, sits closest to where the ridge and the moisture plume are expected to interact most directly, which tends to put it in the crosshairs for both the sharpest heat and the heaviest rainfall. The Northeast, from New York up through New England, is more likely to feel the tail end of the pattern, still hot and humid, but with a greater chance that the digging trough to the north brings at least some relief before the worst of the tropical moisture arrives. Meanwhile, the Southeast, particularly Florida and the Carolinas, sits closest to the tropical low tracking up from the south, which means those areas may see the heaviest and most persistent rainfall risk of the entire region, even if their heat numbers end up being less extreme than what the mid-Atlantic experiences. Nobody along this entire corridor should assume the forecast for one city applies neatly to their own, which is exactly why local National Weather Service offices issue their own specific outlooks layered on top of the broader regional picture. Let's also talk about the economic and logistical ripple effects of a pattern like this, because the impact extends well beyond individual comfort or safety on any single day. Airports along the East Coast corridor are some of the busiest in the country, and both heavy rainfall and coastal low-pressure systems are notorious for producing exactly the kind of low-visibility, gusty wind conditions that trigger ground stops and rolling delays. A slow-moving coastal low parked off the coast for several days can back up flight schedules across the entire country, not just locally, because so many connecting flights route through major hubs along that stretch of coastline. Shipping and port operations face similar strain, since rough surf and high winds can delay cargo operations at major ports, and heavy inland flooding can disrupt the rail and trucking routes that move goods away from those ports once they arrive. None of this rises to the level of the direct safety concerns around flooding and rip currents, but it is part of why a pattern like this draws attention well beyond the weather desk, showing up in logistics planning and travel advisories as well. I also want to address something that comes up constantly whenever a multi-hazard pattern like this gets discussed publicly, which is the tendency for people to fixate on the single most dramatic possibility, a major tropical system, a record-shattering flood, while losing sight of the more mundane but statistically more dangerous hazards sitting right alongside it. It is natural for attention to gravitate toward the ideas of a named storm forming off the southeast coast, but the reality is that the heat alone, quietly building across the mid-Atlantic in the early part of this window, is likely to pose a greater cumulative risk to human life than any single dramatic flooding event, simply because so many more people are exposed to it for so many more hours across so many more days. There's one more angle worth covering before we wrap this up, and it has to do with how this pattern fits into the broader shape of the summer as a whole. Every heat dome, every flooding rain event, every stretch of dangerous surf this year has been part of the same underlying seasonal story, an unusually active, moisture-rich, heat-prone pattern that keeps regenerating rather than settling into the kind of quieter stretches a typical summer usually includes. Forecasters tracking the medium and long-range outlooks have suggested this active pattern could persist well beyond this particular 10-day window, which means the East Coast, and really the country as a whole, should not treat this as an isolated event to get through before returning to normal. It may be closer to the new normal for at least the remainder of this particular summer, with each new stretch of hazardous weather building on the moisture, heat, and instability left behind by the one before it. So let me pull this all together into what really matters. First, the East Coast is heading into a 10-day window where a rebuilding ridge of high pressure is set to collide with a digging trough and a fresh surge of tropical moisture. A combination that tends to produce exactly the kind of hazardous weather forecasters are now flagging. Second, the early part of the window favors a return of significant heat and humidity, particularly across the mid-Atlantic and Northeast, following the same rotating pattern that has driven the entire summer. Third, as tropical moisture and a strengthening coastal low interact with that heat, the risk shifts toward heavy, potentially flooding rainfall, along with dangerous coastal conditions, including rough surf, rip currents, and possible coastal flooding. Fourth, wildfire smoke drifting down from Canada adds an air quality hazard layered on top of the heat and rain risk, particularly from the Great Lakes through New England. And fifth, while the exact day-by-day details will sharpen as the window approaches, the underlying pattern driving all of this, a warmer, wetter atmosphere prone to compounding hazards, is one forecasters have been tracking with real confidence all summer long. It's also worth thinking briefly about how a household should actually stock up ahead of a stretch like this, since the preparation for a flooding and heat event looks a little different than preparation for a pure heat wave alone. Beyond the usual water and non-perishable food, it's worth keeping a battery-powered or hand-crank radio on hand, since flash flood warnings sometimes arrive faster than power stays on, and cellular networks can become congested or lose service entirely during the most severe bursts of a coastal low. If you live in a flood-prone area, know in advance where your important documents are and consider keeping copies somewhere elevated or digitally backed up, since flash flooding can move into a home with far less warning than a slow rising river. And if you are near the coast specifically, keep in mind that a persistent onshore flow during a stalled coastal low can produce what's sometimes called nuisance flooding during ordinary high tides, meaning streets that never normally flood may become impassable purely from the combination of high tide and onshore wind, even without a drop of rain falling directly overhead. And yet, with all of that said, I want to end on the same honest note I have carried throughout. This is not a claim that every single day of the next 10 will bring disaster to every corner of the East Coast. Patterns like this always have variation built in. Some areas will see the worst of the flooding, while others nearby stay largely dry. Some coastal stretches will face the roughest surf, while others see comparatively calm water. What the forecasters are telling us, clearly and with real confidence in the broad pattern, is that the ingredients for a genuinely hazardous, multi-part stretch of weather are lining up over the same region within the same window. And that is exactly the kind of setup that has justified an early warning rather than a wait-and-see approach. If you live anywhere along the East Coast, the preparation for the days ahead is straightforward and worth doing now rather than waiting for the warnings to become urgent. Know your local flood-prone spots and plan alternate routes. Respect beach hazard statements even on days that look calm from the shore. Keep an eye on air quality if you or someone in your household is vulnerable to smoke. And treat any flash flood warning with immediate seriousness, because that hazard, more than almost any other in this pattern, can turn dangerous with very little notice. The ridge is rebuilding, the moisture is gathering, and the coastal low is taking shape, and forecasters have done their part by giving this region 10 days of advance notice. What happens next is largely a matter of how seriously that notice gets taken. I will keep following this pattern closely and bringing you clear, honest updates as the forecast sharpens.